The ad hominem fallacy. Imagine two people sitting across from each other. One speaks of an idea, a concept that floats upward, taking shape in the space above them. The other looks not at the idea but at the person who offered it. How can we trust this thought, they wonder, when the person who shared it has been wrong before? The idea itself remains unexamined while the focus shifts to the character of the messenger. This is the ad hominem fallacy, a gentle turning away from what is said to who is saying it. In Latin, ad hominem means to the person. When we fall into this pattern, we evaluate the merit of an argument based on our feelings about the person making it, rather than considering the substance of their words. It feels natural, this tendency to filter ideas through our impressions of their source. A statement from someone we admire may glow with presumed truth, while the same words from someone we distrust might appear shadowed with doubt. Consider the professor whose research is dismissed not because of flaws in methodology, but because they once held a controversial view on an unrelated topic. Or the friend whose restaurant recommendation is ignored simply because they once suggested a film you did not enjoy. The ideas themselves never receive their fair hearing, judged instead by the perceived character of their messenger. We humans are social creatures, attuned to the complex web of trust and reputation. Our ancestors survived partly by quickly assessing who could be relied upon. This evolutionary legacy remains with us, this tendency to conflate the message with the messenger. There is wisdom in considering the source, yet when this becomes our primary means of evaluation, nuance dissolves into simplicity. Think of how often wisdom has come from unexpected sources. The child who sees what adults cannot, the outsider who brings a fresh perspective to old problems, the flawed messenger who nevertheless carries a fragment of truth. When we dismiss ideas based solely on their origin, we may miss these hidden treasures, these unlikely gifts of insight. As we proceed, consider how thoughts might exist independently of those who voice them, like stars that shine regardless of who points them out in the night sky. The ad hominem fallacy reminds us to look upward at the idea itself, to evaluate its merits on their own terms, allowing even imperfect messengers to sometimes bring us perfect clarity. The straw man fallacy. Let's say two figures stand in conversation. One carefully builds an argument, shaping it with thought and care, but the other does something curious. Instead of addressing what was actually said, they construct something different, something easier to knock down, like building a figure of straw rather than engaging with the person before them. This is the straw man fallacy, the gentle substitution of a weaker argument for the one actually presented. When we create a straw man, we transform our conversation partner's position into something more extreme, more absurd, or simply different than what they intended. We might exaggerate their claim, take it out of context, or focus on the weakest part while ignoring the rest. Then, having created this more vulnerable version, we direct our response to the imposter rather than the original. Picture the environmentalist who suggests reducing plastic waste, only to hear, "So you want to ban all modern conveniences and have us live in caves?" Or imagine the person who proposes more funding for libraries being told they want to bankrupt the city budget. The original nuanced positions become caricatures, easier to dismiss but no longer recognizable to those who proposed them. Why does our thinking sometimes follow this pattern? Perhaps because argumentation requires effort, and addressing the strongest version of an opposing view demands intellectual work we might prefer to avoid. Or maybe it stems from our natural tendency to categorize, to place ideas into familiar boxes even when they do not quite fit. Sometimes we may not even realize we are doing it, sincerely believing we understand positions we have unconsciously simplified. There is a certain comfort in reducing complex positions to manageable oppositions. The world feels more orderly when viewpoints can be neatly labeled and filed away. Yet in this simplification, we lose the rich texture of human thought, the subtle shades of meaning that often contain the most valuable insights. Now consider how understanding might deepen if we were to strengthen rather than weaken the arguments we encounter. What if, instead of straw men, we built steel men, the strongest possible versions of perspectives different from our own? Perhaps then, conversations might become not contests to be won but explorations to be shared. The straw man stands in the field of discourse, a testament to our desire for easier victories rather than deeper understanding. The bandwagon fallacy. Imagine a person asks, "How do you know which restaurant serves the best food in town?" Another answers confidently, "It must be the one with the longest line outside. Everyone goes there, so it must be good." This is the bandwagon fallacy, the soft assumption that popularity necessarily indicates correctness or quality. When we appeal to the bandwagon, we substitute consensus for evidence, treating widespread belief or behavior as proof of truth or value. It feels reassuring, this deference to collective wisdom. Surely so many people cannot all be mistaken. Yet throughout history, majorities have embraced ideas later proven false, and crowds have followed trends that seem baffling in retrospect. Consider the student who justifies procrastination by noting that all their classmates wait until the last minute too. Or the investor who buys a stock solely because everyone else seems to be doing the same. Or the person who adopts a viewpoint not because they have examined the evidence, but because it represents the prevailing opinion in their social circle. In each case, the number of adherents substitutes for the strength of the argument itself. Our susceptibility to this pattern likely reflects our deeply social nature. Humans evolved as tribal creatures, and alignment with group consensus offered survival advantages for most of our history. There is an ancient wisdom in sometimes following the crowd, in recognizing that collective knowledge often exceeds individual insight. Yet this heuristic becomes a fallacy when we apply it uncritically, when we forget that even widespread agreement offers no guarantee of truth. Thinking about crowds and consensus has occupied philosophers for millennia. Plato worried about the wisdom of majorities. Thoreau celebrated the virtues of those who marched to different drummers. The tension between individual judgment and social harmony represents one of the enduring challenges of human existence. Having said that, consider how progress often begins with minority viewpoints, with ideas initially rejected by the mainstream. The most important innovations frequently appear first as deviations from consensus, as departures from what everyone knows to be true. Truth itself remains unchanged by the number of people who recognize it. The bandwagon rolls through human history, sometimes carrying us toward wisdom, but just as often toward collective error. The ability to decide when to join the crowd and when to stand apart represents an essential aspect of intellectual maturity. The false dilemma fallacy. Imagine two paths stretching before a solitary wanderer. "You must choose either this road or that one," a voice whispers. Though in reality, countless trails wind through the landscape, some not yet visible in the dim light. This is the false dilemma fallacy, the quiet insistence that only two options exist when many more possibilities remain unexplored. When we encounter a false dilemma, sometimes called a false dichotomy, the complex spectrum of choices becomes artificially reduced to just two alternatives, often at opposite extremes. This simplification feels clarifying, creating a world of either, or where the messy reality of multiple options might otherwise overwhelm us. Yet in this reduction, nuance vanishes and middle paths disappear from view. Imagine the friend who declares, "Either you support every decision I make or you are not really my friend," overlooking the possibility of supportive critique. Or the debate where participants must be categorized as entirely for or against a complex policy with many dimensions. Or the internal voice that insists we must either pursue our passion completely or abandon it entirely, ignoring countless moderate approaches between these poles. Why do our minds gravitate toward these choices? Perhaps because decisions become simpler when options are fewer. The cognitive effort required to evaluate many possibilities exceeds that needed for just two. Or maybe it reflects our narrative instincts, our love of stories with clear oppositions and dramatic choices. Some false dilemmas may even arise from genuine difficulty in perceiving alternatives rather than any intent to mislead ourselves or others. There is a certain dramatic satisfaction in stark choices. Literature and philosophy have long explored moments of profound either-or decisions. Yet most of life unfolds in the rich territory between extremes, in the gentle compromises and creative solutions that become invisible when we limit ourselves to only two possibilities. As we proceed, consider how often the phrase "third way" has resolved seemingly irreconcilable options throughout human history. The most elegant solutions sometimes emerge not from choosing between existing alternatives, but from discovering or creating paths not initially apparent. The false dilemma dissolves when we pause to look beyond the obvious choices presented to us. The night sky contains not just two stars but countless points of light, some brighter, some more distant, creating infinite patterns for those patient enough to observe them. Similarly, most situations offer more possibilities than first apparent to those willing to search for them. Slippery slope fallacy. Assume a worried figure ponders a small step forward. If I allow this tiny change, they think, inevitably a cascade of increasingly terrible consequences will follow. Their mind races down a path from a modest beginning to a catastrophic end, each step supposedly leading inexorably to the next. This is the slippery slope fallacy, the quiet conviction that one action must trigger an unstoppable sequence of increasingly dire events. When we envision a slippery slope, we create a mental chain of causation where accepting one thing means we cannot logically prevent a series of subsequent, more extreme outcomes. It feels intuitive, this sense that boundaries once crossed cannot be reestablished, that precedents once set must dictate future decisions. Yet this reasoning often neglects the very real possibility that we might simply stop sliding down the slope at any point. Consider the parent who refuses to let their child stay up 15 minutes later, fearing this will inevitably lead to midnight bedtimes. Or societies that resist modest reforms with apocalyptic predictions that rarely materialize. In each case, the capacity for future choice and moderation vanishes from consideration. Our susceptibility to this pattern of thought may derive from genuine pattern recognition abilities that have served us well throughout evolutionary history. We survived partly by noticing trends and projecting them forward. Or perhaps it emerges from our narrative instinct, our tendency to see stories with beginning, middle, and end, where life presents us with more complex and contingent scenarios. There is wisdom in considering future implications of present choices. Foresight and prudence require us to think beyond immediate consequences. Yet the slippery slope fallacy transforms this reasonable caution into fatalistic resignation, assuming that initial steps eliminate all future agency and discernment. Now consider how rarely the most catastrophic versions of slippery slope predictions actually materialize in reality. How often we discover that even after taking that first concerning step, we retain our ability to evaluate each subsequent choice on its own merits, finding stable footing even on supposedly slippery ground. The slope of life includes many places to pause, many moments to reassess and change direction. Our capacity for judgment remains with us at every point of the journey, not just at its beginning. Let this reassuring thought accompany you as we continue our exploration of the landscapes of human reasoning. Circular reasoning fallacy. Imagine a person makes a curious claim. This ancient text must be true, the voice insists, because it says within its pages that it cannot contain falsehoods. Notice the perfect circle formed by this reasoning, where the conclusion serves as its own premise and the premise relies upon accepting the conclusion. This is the circular reasoning fallacy, the gentle loop that leads nowhere while appearing to move forward. When we engage in circular reasoning, sometimes called begging the question, we assume the very thing we are trying to prove. The conclusion hides within the premise, disguised but present from the beginning. It feels satisfying, this perfect circuit of logic, its seamless structure creating an illusion of soundness. Yet no new information actually enters the system, nothing is truly demonstrated. Consider the job applicant who claims they must be trustworthy because they would never lie about their character. Or the student who insists their late paper deserves full credit because they should not be penalized for tardiness. Or the product advertised as superior because it is the best choice. In each case, the argument relies on accepting its conclusion in order to believe its premise. Our vulnerability to circular reasoning may stem from our comfort with patterns that close neatly, from our preference for completeness over open questions. There is something aesthetically pleasing about an argument that returns to its beginning, something that satisfies our desire for resolution and closure. Sometimes we may not even notice the circularity, especially when the circle is drawn large enough that its curve appears momentarily straight. There exists a certain poetry in these perfect loops of reasoning. Throughout history, mystics and philosophers have contemplated circularity as a profound concept. Yet when seeking to establish truth through reasoned argument, we require external evidence, premises that stand independently of our desired conclusion. As we proceed, consider how often genuine understanding requires us to step outside of comfortable circles, to seek foundations beyond the assertions we wish to prove. The most reliable knowledge builds upward from independent premises rather than cycling endlessly through self-reference. The circle of reasoning spins like a wheel that produces no forward motion, creating only the illusion of progress. Yet awareness of this pattern offers us the opportunity to break free from such loops, to seek paths of thought that truly advance our understanding. Appeal to authority fallacy. Imagine a person makes a claim not based on evidence or reasoning but resting entirely on the words of someone important, someone respected. This must be true, the voice suggests, because an authority has said so. This is the appeal to authority fallacy, the gentle surrender of our own judgment to the pronouncements of those we perceive as experts, regardless of whether their expertise is relevant or their claims supported. When we appeal to authority, we substitute the status of the speaker for the substance of their argument. The white lab coat, the impressive title, the years of experience in an unrelated field all become proxies for truth itself. It feels reassuring, this deference to those who seem to know more than we do. Yet expertise in one area does not guarantee wisdom in all matters, and even genuine authorities can be mistaken. Consider the celebrated physicist whose views on economics are given weight despite having no training in that field, or the successful business leader whose opinions on public health are valued above those of medical researchers. In each case, the relevant question becomes not who said it, but rather what evidence supports it. Our tendency toward this pattern may stem from the overwhelming complexity of the modern world. No single person can be expert in all things, so we develop mental shortcuts, trusting certain voices to guide us through unfamiliar territory. This heuristic serves us well in many contexts, but leads us astray when we fail to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate appeals to expertise. There is a certain humility in recognizing authorities, an acknowledgement that others have dedicated their lives to understanding subjects we have only glimpsed. Yet true intellectual humility includes questioning, weighing evidence, and recognizing the limits of expertise. The most trustworthy authorities are often those who clearly state the boundaries of their knowledge, who present not just conclusions but the reasoning and evidence behind them. Now consider the difference between respecting expertise and surrendering critical thought. Perhaps wisdom lies in navigating between excessive skepticism that trusts no one and blind faith that questions nothing. Each of us is capable of reasoned judgment, of weighing claims based on evidence rather than status alone. The appeal to authority whispers that truth is determined by who speaks, but a deeper wisdom suggests that what is said, and why, matter far more than who says it. Hasty generalization fallacy. Assume someone recounts a disappointing experience. The one time I visited Chicago, they recall, it rained the entire weekend. Chicago has terrible weather. Notice how quickly a single data point transforms into a sweeping conclusion. This is the hasty generalization fallacy, the gentle leap from limited evidence to broad pronouncement. When we make hasty generalizations, we draw conclusions about entire categories based on insufficient samples. It feels efficient, this quick movement from specific instance to general rule. Our minds naturally seek patterns, and generalizing helps us navigate a complex world. Yet when our sample is too small, unrepresentative, or biased, the patterns we perceive may exist only in our interpretation. Consider the traveler who visits one restaurant in a foreign country and declares the entire national cuisine unappetizing. Or the manager who hires someone from a particular university who performs poorly, then refuses to interview any future candidates from that institution. Or the person who experiences one mechanical problem with a car brand and concludes all vehicles from that manufacturer must be unreliable. In each case, a limited experience becomes the foundation for a much broader judgment. Our tendency toward hasty generalization likely reflects both cognitive efficiency and evolutionary history. Forming quick assessments based on limited information sometimes offered survival advantages to our ancestors. There is a certain pragmatic wisdom in learning from experience, in adjusting expectations based on previous encounters. Yet reliable understanding requires us to remain aware of sample size, to question whether our experiences truly represent the whole we seek to understand. Statisticians and scientists have formalized methods to guard against this very human tendency, developing techniques to ensure representative sampling and appropriate confidence levels. These disciplines remind us that the path from specific observations to general conclusions requires careful attention to evidence. As we proceed, consider how often initial impressions give way to more nuanced understanding with greater exposure. First encounters, while vivid and memorable, rarely reveal the full complexity of people, places, or situations. The most reliable knowledge often emerges not from single experiences, but from patterns observed across multiple encounters. The hasty generalization transforms limited glimpses into supposed comprehensive vision, mistaking the part for the whole. Yet wisdom often lies in maintaining provisional judgments, in recognizing that our current understanding may reflect more about the limitation of our experience than about the full reality we seek to comprehend. Appeal to emotion fallacy. Imagine someone makes a passionate plea. Their voice trembles with feeling, their eyes brim with tears, their hands gesture dramatically. You find yourself agreeing before fully considering what they have said, moved more by the emotion conveyed than by any evidence presented. This is the appeal to emotion fallacy, the gentle substitution of feeling for reasoning. When we appeal to emotion, we bypass critical thinking in favor of emotional response. It feels authentic, this prioritization of heart over head. After all, emotions represent an essential aspect of human experience, a source of meaning and connection. Yet when emotions become not just part of our deliberations but their entire substance, reason retreats and judgment becomes clouded. Consider the charity advertisement that shows heart-rending images of suffering but offers no information about how donations will be used. Or the political speech filled with patriotic fervor but empty of specific policy proposals. Or the friend who responds to factual criticism with displays of hurt feelings rather than substantive counterarguments. In each case, emotional impact substitutes for logical coherence or evidential support. Our vulnerability to emotional appeals stems partly from our nature as feeling beings. Emotions evolved long before rational thought in our evolutionary history, and they continue to process information more quickly than our deliberative faculties. There is wisdom in emotional intelligence, in recognizing the importance of feelings as signals and sources of insight. Yet when emotions completely override analysis, we lose the balance that characterizes sound judgment. Philosophy has long contemplated the relationship between reason and emotion. Plato described reason as the charioteer that must guide the horses of passion. Hume argued that reason serves rather than rules our sentiments. The ideal likely involves integration rather than dominance of either faculty over the other. Now consider how the most compelling arguments engage both heart and mind, appealing to emotions while also satisfying rational scrutiny. The wisest decisions often emerge when feelings inform but do not replace careful thought, when compassion and analysis work as partners rather than rivals. The appeal to emotion speaks to our humanity, to our capacity for empathy and concern. These qualities enrich our lives immeasurably, yet they serve us best when complemented by critical reflection, by the pause that allows us to ask whether a position merits our agreement not just because it moves us, but because it withstands examination. Appeal to ignorance fallacy. Imagine a person declares, "No one has ever proven that ghosts do not exist, therefore they must be real." Notice the curious logic here, transforming absence of evidence into evidence of presence. This is the appeal to ignorance fallacy, the quiet assumption that if something has not been disproven, it must be true, or conversely, that if something has not been proven, it must be false. When we appeal to ignorance, we treat gaps in knowledge as if they were positive evidence for our preferred conclusion. It feels certain, this way of reasoning that transforms uncertainty into supposed proof. Yet absence of evidence often tells us more about the limits of our investigation than about the truth of the matter being investigated. Consider the person who insists ancient astronauts built the pyramids because historians cannot explain every detail of their construction, or the debater who claims their point stands because their opponent has not refuted it to their satisfaction, or the superstitious individual who believes in a lucky charm because nothing bad has happened while carrying it. In each case, the unknown becomes grounds for specific belief rather than acknowledged uncertainty. Our tendency toward this pattern may reflect our profound discomfort with ambiguity. Human minds prefer conclusion to confusion, certainty to doubt. There is something unsettling about simply saying we do not know, about allowing questions to remain open. Sometimes appealing to ignorance may represent not a deliberate fallacy, but an unconscious move to resolve cognitive dissonance. Philosophers throughout history have contemplated the significance of what we do not know. Socrates found wisdom in acknowledging ignorance. Scientific method builds progress on provisional knowledge rather than absolute certainty. The spaces between what we have proven and disproven deserve respect rather than hasty filling. Now consider how intellectual honesty often requires us to recognize the boundaries of our knowledge. The most reliable understanding grows from acknowledging what remains uncertain, from treating unknowns as invitations to further inquiry rather than as evidence for pre-established conclusions. The appeal to ignorance transforms mystery into false certainty, treating the absence of information as if it were confirmation. Yet embracing the unknown can be its own form of wisdom, an acknowledgement of the vastness that exceeds our current understanding. The middle ground fallacy. Imagine two voices debating earnestly. One claims the moon is made entirely of cheese while the other insists it is composed solely of rock. A third voice enters, suggesting reasonably that the truth must lie somewhere in between, perhaps the moon is half cheese and half rock. This is the middle ground fallacy, the gentle assumption that compromise between any two positions must represent the truth. When we fall into the middle ground fallacy, sometimes called the argument to moderation, we presume that the middle position between two extremes is automatically the most reasonable or accurate. It feels balanced, this search for compromise between opposing viewpoints. Yet when one position aligns with evidence and the other contradicts it, the midpoint represents not wisdom but merely a different form of error. Consider the debate where one person argues for extensive environmental regulations based on scientific consensus, while another denies any need for regulation whatsoever, leading a mediator to suggest moderate regulations as obviously correct without examining the evidence. Or historical situations where oppression is met with demands for justice, yet some insist the fair solution must be partial continuation of oppression. Or medical discussions where evidence-based treatments are countered by harmful alternatives, with some suggesting patients should use a bit of both. In each case, the compromise position gains credibility merely from being intermediate rather than from its actual merit. Our tendency toward this pattern may reflect both social and cognitive factors. Compromise often helps maintain social harmony, and throughout human history, moderate positions have frequently helped resolve conflict. There is wisdom in seeking balance, in recognizing that extreme claims often prove exaggerated. Yet this heuristic becomes fallacious when applied mechanically, when moderation is treated as inherently superior regardless of the specific claims involved. Philosophers have long contemplated the relationship between compromise and truth. Aristotle valued the golden mean between extremes, yet recognized that virtue depends on finding the right balance in specific contexts, not merely splitting the difference between options. Modern thought emphasizes that truth claims must be evaluated on their merits rather than their position on a spectrum. Now consider how genuine understanding requires evaluating claims based on evidence rather than merely their relative position. Sometimes truth does lie in the middle, but often it aligns more closely with one perspective than another. The wisest approach evaluates each situation uniquely rather than assuming moderation always equals accuracy. The middle ground fallacy mistakes compromise for truth, positioning between extremes for accuracy. Yet reality concerns itself with evidence rather than averages, with correspondence to fact rather than with position on a spectrum. No true Scotsman fallacy. Suppose someone makes a curious claim. No philosopher ever enjoys action movies, they state confidently. When you mention a philosophy professor who loves such films, they respond without hesitation, well, no true philosopher would enjoy such mindless entertainment. Notice how the original claim remains intact through a subtle redefinition. This is the no true Scotsman fallacy, the quiet moving of goalposts to protect a generalization from counterexamples. When we employ the no true Scotsman fallacy, we preserve our claims against contradictory evidence by implicitly redefining our terms. It feels seamless, this protection of our assertions through retroactive qualification. Yet this maneuver transforms empirical claims into unfalsifiable ones, making them immune to evidence rather than supported by it. Consider the sports fan who declares their team always plays with heart. then dismisses a lackluster performance by claiming the players were not truly themselves today. In this case, the original assertion avoids refutation by silently changing meaning after encountering contradictory evidence. Our vulnerability to this pattern may reflect our deep psychological investment in our beliefs and categories. Humans naturally resist information that challenges established viewpoints. There is a certain cognitive efficiency in maintaining existing frameworks rather than revising them. Yet intellectual growth often requires allowing our assertions to remain vulnerable to potential falsification, to engage honestly with counterexamples rather than defining them away. Philosophers of science have emphasized the importance of falsifiability in meaningful claims. Popper noted that unfalsifiable assertions, while perhaps comforting, cannot truly advance our understanding since they remain unchanged regardless of what evidence we encounter. As we proceed, consider how genuine understanding often emerges from allowing our beliefs to be tested rather than protected. The most reliable knowledge develops through honest engagement with contradictory evidence, through revision rather than redefinition when our generalizations face legitimate counterexamples. The no true Scotsman fallacy preserves beliefs by making them impervious to challenge, shifting definitions to exclude inconvenient cases. Yet intellectual honesty requires us to acknowledge when our generalizations overreach, when exceptions reveal the limits of our claims rather than the limits of category membership. Personal incredulity fallacy assumes someone encounters an unfamiliar concept. I cannot understand how this could possibly work, they declare with certainty, therefore it must be false. Notice how their personal confusion becomes the standard for truth. This is the personal incredulity fallacy, the quiet assumption that one's own comprehension defines the boundaries of possibility. When we employ personal incredulity, we mistake our inability to understand something for evidence against it. It feels intuitive, this tendency to doubt what we cannot immediately grasp. Yet the limits of our comprehension reflect our own constraints rather than the constraints of reality itself, which frequently exceeds our immediate understanding. Consider the person who dismisses evolutionary theory because they cannot imagine how complex structures could develop incrementally. Or the student who rejects mathematical proofs they find confusing rather than working to understand them. Or the individual who declares quantum physics must be nonsense simply because its counterintuitive implications baffle them. In each case, personal cognitive limitations become the measure of plausibility, substituting subjective confusion for objective evaluation. Our vulnerability to this pattern likely reflects both cognitive economy and natural egocentrism. Humans instinctively use themselves as reference points for understanding the world. There is a certain efficiency in trusting our intuitions, in using our comprehension as a guide to plausibility. Yet the universe continuously proves itself stranger and more complex than our intuitions suggest, operating according to principles that may initially seem bewildering. Philosophers of science note that many revolutionary ideas faced rejection not because of evidential failure, but because they seemed incomprehensible within existing frameworks. Relativity, heliocentrism, and countless other advances initially appeared counterintuitive, yet proved demonstrably accurate. The history of knowledge demonstrates that reality does not constrain itself to what humans find immediately understandable. Now consider how often genuine understanding requires us to move beyond initial incomprehension, to recognize that our confusion represents an opportunity for learning rather than a justification for dismissal. The most profound insights sometimes emerge from precisely those concepts that initially seem most bewildering. The personal incredulity fallacy mistakes subjective confusion for objective implausibility, transforming cognitive limitations into supposed evidence. Yet the boundaries of possibility extend far beyond the boundaries of our immediate comprehension, inviting us to expand our understanding rather than restrict our acceptance to what already feels intuitive. The genetic fallacy. Let's say someone dismisses an idea without consideration. That suggestion comes from a new employee, they explain, so it cannot possibly have merit. Notice how the origin of the idea determines its evaluation regardless of content. This is the genetic fallacy, the gentle assumption that the source of a claim determines its truth or value. When we commit the genetic fallacy, we evaluate ideas based on their origins rather than their substance. It feels natural, this tendency to associate claims with their sources. Yet the merit of an idea exists independently of its genesis, with even unlikely sources sometimes offering valuable insights and respected sources occasionally producing errors. Consider the reader who dismisses a news article solely because it appears in a source they generally distrust without examining its specific evidence, or the person who accepts information uncritically because it comes from an authority figure they admire, or the decision-maker who rejects a proposal because it originated with a rival department rather than assessing its actual benefits. In each case, judgments about source substitute for evaluation of content. Our susceptibility to this pattern likely reflects both cognitive efficiency and social dynamics. Source evaluation provides a quick heuristic when assessing numerous claims. There is wisdom in considering reputation and track record when time constraints prevent detailed analysis of every assertion. Yet when origin becomes the sole determinant of acceptance or rejection, we sacrifice discernment for simplicity. Philosophers distinguish between contexts where source matters and where it does not. Questions of historical influence properly consider origins. Questions of logical validity or empirical accuracy focus on internal coherence and evidential support. The genetic fallacy occurs when we conflate these different types of evaluation, when we treat questions of fact as if they were questions of origin. As we proceed, consider how ideas may transform and transcend their beginnings, how concepts can deserve consideration regardless of where they first emerged. The most reliable evaluation examines both source credibility and substantive content, recognizing that even trusted sources may err and unlikely sources may occasionally offer truth. The genetic fallacy reduces ideas to their origins, allowing birthplace to determine perceived worth. Yet the value of a concept ultimately resides in its correspondence with reality and internal coherence rather than in its genealogy. The burden of proof fallacy. Imagine someone makes an extraordinary claim. When asked for evidence, they respond, "Well, you cannot prove that I am wrong." Notice the subtle shift of responsibility, placing the obligation to disprove on the skeptic rather than the obligation to prove on the claimant. This is the burden of proof fallacy, the quiet reversal of evidential responsibility. When we misplace the burden of proof, we demand that others disprove our assertions rather than providing adequate support for them ourselves. It feels protective, this shifting of responsibility away from our own claims. Yet logically, the obligation to provide evidence rests primarily with the person making an assertion, particularly when that assertion contradicts established understanding. Consider the conspiracy theorist who insists their elaborate scenario must be accepted because no one can definitively prove it false, or the student who claims they deserve an A despite missing assignments, challenging the instructor to prove they would not have excelled, or the person who asserts the existence of phenomena beyond conventional understanding, then criticizes skeptics for not disproving possibilities that inherently resist verification. In each case, the absence of disproof becomes treated as support, reversing the normal standards of evidence. Our tendency toward this pattern likely reflects both psychological defensiveness and cognitive economy. Shifting the burden of proof protects our assertions from scrutiny. There is a certain intuitive appeal to the idea that all possibilities remain open until conclusively refuted. Yet practically, this approach would require us to give equal consideration to an infinite number of unsupported claims, as most assertions cannot be definitively disproved. Philosophers of science and epistemology emphasize the importance of appropriate evidence standards. The principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence acknowledges that assertions that contradict established understanding naturally bear a heavier burden of proof than those consistent with what we already know. Now consider how productive discourse depends on shared standards of evidence, on agreement about who bears responsibility for supporting different types of claims. The most reliable path to understanding involves accepting appropriate burdens of evidence rather than attempting to shift them to others. The burden of proof fallacy transforms "you cannot prove me wrong" into supposed support for a claim. Yet absence of disproof differs fundamentally from presence of proof. Claims ultimately require positive evidence proportional to their deviation from established knowledge. The sunk cost fallacy. Assume someone makes a puzzling decision. I know this project is failing, they admit, but I have already invested so much time and resources that I cannot possibly abandon it now. Notice how past investments dictate future choices regardless of future prospects. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the quiet insistence that we must continue a course of action because of what we have already invested rather than based on future outcomes. When we fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy, we consider resources already spent when making decisions about moving forward. It feels responsible, this reluctance to waste previous investments. Yet economically and logically, only future costs and benefits should influence current decisions. Past expenditures cannot be recovered regardless of what we choose now. Consider the moviegoer who continues watching a film they dislike simply because they paid for the ticket, or the organization that continues funding an unpromising initiative solely because of previous expenditures, or the individual who remains in an unfulfilling relationship or career primarily because of the years already invested. In each case, irrecoverable past investments influence decisions that should logically focus only on future prospects. Our vulnerability to this pattern likely reflects both emotional and cognitive factors. Abandoning investments can trigger feelings of regret or failure. There is a certain psychological coherence in trying to justify past choices through continued commitment. Yet rational decision-making requires recognizing that sunk costs remain sunk regardless of our subsequent choices. Economists and decision theorists emphasize the importance of marginal analysis, of considering only those costs and benefits that differ between options moving forward. The past, while informative, cannot be changed by present decisions and should not dictate choices except to the extent it provides information relevant to future outcomes. As we proceed, consider how sometimes the wisest course involves acknowledging losses and changing direction, how continued investment in unpromising paths often reflects emotional attachment rather than rational calculation. The most freeing realization may be that past investments need not determine future choices when those investments cannot be recovered. The sunk cost fallacy chains us to past decisions through the weight of previous investments. Yet forward-looking wisdom considers where we might go rather than merely what road brought us here, evaluating options based on future prospects rather than resources already spent. The false equivalence fallacy. Imagine someone makes a comparison. Both candidates have faced criticism, they observe, so neither has any moral advantage over the other. Notice how situations with vastly different magnitudes are treated as essentially identical. This is the false equivalence fallacy, the quiet equation of fundamentally dissimilar things based on superficial similarities. When we draw false equivalences, we treat significantly different situations, actions, or ideas as if they were effectively the same. It feels balanced, this suggestion that compared entities share equal status. Yet meaningful differences in degree, context, evidence, or impact often separate seemingly similar cases, making equation misleading rather than clarifying. Consider the person who equates a minor social faux pas with a serious ethical violation, claiming both represent just mistakes. Or the argument that treats expert consensus supported by extensive evidence as equivalent to a contrarian opinion with minimal support, since both are just viewpoints. Or the comparison suggesting that two historical events are fundamentally the same because they share one element, while ignoring crucial distinctions in context and scale. In each case, superficial resemblance obscures essential differences. Our vulnerability to this pattern likely reflects both cognitive and social factors. Black and white thinking simplifies complex judgments into easier categories. There is social advantage in appearing fair and balanced by treating opposing positions as equivalent. Yet genuine understanding often requires recognizing meaningful distinctions in magnitude, evidence, and context rather than flattening these into false symmetry. Philosophers and ethicists emphasize the importance of proportionality in judgment and comparison, of ensuring that our evaluations reflect genuine similarities and differences rather than merely appearing balanced. The principle that treating unequals equally is as unjust as treating equals unequally acknowledges the importance of appropriate distinction. As we proceed, consider how nuanced understanding often lies not in declaring things equivalent or entirely different, but in carefully mapping both similarities and differences in appropriate proportion. The most accurate comparisons acknowledge both points of connection and meaningful distinctions, resisting the temptation to oversimplify through false equations. The false equivalence fallacy mistakes superficial similarity for essential identity, equating situations that share only limited commonality. Yet meaningful evaluation requires acknowledging degrees of difference as well as points of similarity, recognizing when distinctions in scale, context, or evidence render simple equations misleading. Appeal to pity fallacy. Assume someone makes their case. You simply must accept my late assignment, they plead, their voice breaking slightly, because I have had such a difficult week and really need to pass this class. Notice how emotional distress becomes the primary argument, sympathy substituting for merit. This is the appeal to pity fallacy, the gentle attempt to win agreement through evoking compassion rather than addressing relevant considerations. When we appeal to pity, we try to obtain support for a conclusion by emphasizing suffering or misfortune instead of providing pertinent reasons. It feels compassionate, this responsiveness to expressions of distress. Yet while empathy represents an essential human quality, decisions and judgments often require criteria beyond emotional response alone. Consider the job applicant who focuses on personal hardships rather than qualifications during an interview, or the defendant who emphasizes family circumstances rather than addressing evidence of guilt or innocence, or the debate participant who highlights their nervousness and the effort they invested rather than supporting their argument with reasoning. In each case, calls for sympathy replace engagement with the actual merits of the situation. Our susceptibility to this pattern likely reflects our natural empathetic capacities. Humans evolved as social creatures responsive to others' distress. There is genuine moral value in compassion, in recognizing and responding to suffering with care. Yet when pity becomes the primary basis for decisions that properly require other criteria, outcomes may ultimately serve neither fairness nor even the long-term interests of those we wish to help. Philosophers throughout history have contemplated the proper relationship between emotion and judgment. Aristotle noted that while emotions provide important information, virtue requires feeling them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, toward the right people, with the right aim, and in the right way. Modern ethical frameworks similarly seek to balance compassionate response with principled consistency. At this stage, consider how genuine care for others might sometimes require maintaining appropriate standards and expectations despite emotional appeals. The most truly supportive approach often involves empathy alongside rather than instead of relevant evaluation, compassion that complements rather than replaces applicable criteria. The appeal to pity substitutes sympathy for substance, emotional response for relevant reasoning. Yet while compassion enriches human interaction immeasurably, decisions frequently require additional foundations to serve genuine fairness and long-term welfare. Moving the goalposts fallacy. Imagine someone evaluates evidence. If this theory were true, they initially declared, we would find fossil evidence in this region. When such fossils are discovered, they respond without hesitation, well, but we would need to find transitional forms too. When these also emerge, they require genetic evidence as well. Notice how the standard of proof continuously shifts, making satisfaction impossible. This is the moving the goalposts fallacy, the quiet change in criteria once initial standards have been met. When we move the goalposts, we change our requirements for accepting a claim after original conditions have been satisfied. It feels thorough, this continuing demand for additional evidence. Yet if standards continuously shift rather than being established in advance, no amount of support can ever prove sufficient, making supposedly evidence-based evaluation impossible in practice. Consider the supervisor who keeps adding new requirements to a project after initial specifications have been met, or the skeptic who demands one type of evidence, then another, never acknowledging when their stated criteria have been fulfilled, or the partner who continuously redefines what would constitute acceptable behavior so that reconciliation remains perpetually out of reach. In each case, satisfaction becomes impossible through continuous redefinition of success. Our tendency toward this pattern may reflect both psychological and strategic factors. Moving targets protect cherished beliefs from challenge. There is intellectual value in thorough investigation and comprehensive evidence. Yet genuine evaluation requires establishing clear, consistent standards rather than continuously inventing new hurdles after previous ones have been cleared. Philosophers of science emphasize the importance of falsifiability in meaningful claims. A hypothesis should specify in advance what would count as evidence against it rather than being perpetually protected through shifting criteria. Similar principles apply in many domains where fair evaluation requires stable rather than mobile standards. As we proceed, consider how productive dialogue often depends on mutual understanding of what constitutes sufficient evidence, on clarity about what would satisfy our questions, rather than endless deferral of acceptance. The most honest inquiry establishes criteria in advance rather than continuously revising them to maintain preferred conclusions. The moving goalposts fallacy transforms evaluation into an impossible task through continuous redefinition of standards. Yet genuine assessment requires fixed rather than mobile criteria, clear specification of what evidence would prove sufficient rather than perpetual demand for more. The gambler's fallacy. Imagine a figure sits quietly watching coins flip through the air. Heads have appeared 5 times in a row and the figure sighs, convinced that tails must be next. It's bound to happen, they think, because the odds are due to even out. This is the gambler's fallacy, the gentle illusion that past random events influence future ones in independent chance processes. When we fall into the gambler's fallacy, we mistake the independence of random events for a balancing force, believing that deviations from expected frequencies must be corrected in the short term. It feels intuitive, this sense of fairness in randomness, that chance owes us a correction. Yet in truly random sequences, each event remains independent. The past does not affect the future. Consider the lottery player who avoids numbers that have recently won, assuming they are less likely to come up again. Or the roulette bettor who increases stakes after a losing streak, convinced that a win must be imminent. Or the sports fan who believes a team is due for victory because of recent losses. In each case, the illusion of balancing probabilities leads to mistaken expectations. Our susceptibility to this fallacy likely reflects our deep-seated desire to find patterns and fairness in randomness. Humans evolved to detect regularities in nature, a skill essential for survival. Yet this same pattern recognition can mislead us when applied to truly random processes where no such balancing occurs. Mathematicians and statisticians emphasize that independent random events lack memory. The probability of each outcome remains constant regardless of previous results. Understanding this principle helps us avoid the pitfalls of gambler's fallacy and make more rational decisions. Now consider the gentle randomness of the universe, events unfolding without memory or obligation. The coins continue to flip, each toss independent, each outcome a fresh beginning. Anecdotal evidence fallacy. Imagine someone makes a confident claim. I have walked alone at night in that neighborhood dozens of times, they say. It's perfectly safe. Notice how a single personal experience transforms into a general conclusion, one story becoming a universal truth. This is the anecdotal evidence fallacy, the gentle elevation of personal experience over systematic investigation. When we rely on anecdotal evidence, we generalize from isolated stories rather than representative data. It feels authentic, this trust in first-hand experience or compelling narratives. After all, personal stories engage us emotionally and remain easy to remember. Yet individual experiences may reflect coincidence, placebo effects, selective memory, or numerous other factors rather than revealing genuine causal relationships. Consider the investor who chooses stocks based on a friend's success story rather than broad market analysis. Or the person who dismisses statistical safety data about a medication because they know someone who experienced a rare side effect. Or the consumer who trusts a product testimonial over controlled studies of effectiveness. In each case, vivid stories outweigh comprehensive evidence, particular experiences override statistical patterns. Our susceptibility to this pattern likely reflects both evolutionary and cognitive factors. Throughout most of human history, personal observation and shared stories represented primary sources of knowledge. There is wisdom in learning from experience, in recognizing the rich information contained in individual cases. Yet modern understanding requires us to complement anecdote with analysis, to recognize that systematic investigation often reveals patterns invisible at the level of individual experience. Statisticians and scientists emphasize the importance of representative sampling precisely because individual cases may mislead rather than illuminate. The law of large numbers and randomized controlled trials exist to overcome the limitations of anecdotal reasoning, to distinguish genuine patterns from coincidental occurrences. Now consider how the most reliable understanding often emerges from integrating both systematic evidence and personal experience, respecting statistics while remembering that each data point represents an individual story. The wisest approach neither dismisses anecdotes entirely nor treats them as sufficient for establishing broad claims. The anecdotal evidence fallacy mistakes stories for statistics, isolated experiences for established patterns. Yet reliable knowledge about general trends requires more than compelling narratives. It demands systematic investigation of representative cases. Appeal to tradition fallacy. Let's say someone explains their perspective. We must continue this practice, they insist, because this is how we have always done things. Notice how longevity alone becomes the justification, tradition substituting for demonstrated value. This is the appeal to tradition fallacy, the quiet assumption that established practices must be maintained simply because of their history. When we appeal to tradition, we treat the age or historical continuity of a practice as sufficient reason for its continuation. It feels comforting, this deference to established patterns. Yet longevity itself proves nothing about merit. Harmful or inefficient practices can persist for generations, while beneficial innovations may require departing from tradition. Consider the organization that maintains outdated procedures despite clear evidence of their inefficiency, justifying continuation solely through reference to institutional history. Or the family that preserves uncomfortable holiday rituals that no one enjoys simply because we have always done it this way. Or the society that preserves inequitable structures by appealing to their historical precedent rather than their current impact. In each case, tradition itself becomes the argument, age replacing analysis. Our tendency toward this pattern likely reflects both psychological and social factors. Traditions provide stability and shared identity in an uncertain world. There is wisdom in respecting practices that have stood the test of time, in recognizing that traditions often contain implicit knowledge developed through generations of experience. Yet uncritical adherence to tradition impedes growth and adaptation, treating what is familiar as necessarily optimal. Philosophers throughout history have contemplated the proper relationship between tradition and progress. Burke emphasized the accumulated wisdom embedded in traditional practices. Mill argued for the importance of questioning received customs to prevent stagnation. The thoughtful approach likely involves neither wholesale rejection nor unquestioning acceptance of traditional ways. As we proceed, consider how the most vibrant traditions themselves evolve over time, adapting to changing circumstances while preserving essential values. The wisest approach neither discards the past nor remains imprisoned by it, instead engaging tradition critically, preserving what remains valuable while allowing modification where needed. The appeal to tradition mistakes longevity for legitimacy, age for virtue. Yet time alone validates nothing. Practices must ultimately be evaluated by their current effects and alignment with core values rather than merely their historical persistence. Appeal to novelty fallacy. Imagine someone enthusiastically promotes an idea. This approach must be superior, they explain, because it is completely new and different from everything that came before. Notice how newness itself becomes the primary virtue, innovation automatically equated with improvement. This is the appeal to novelty fallacy, the gentle assumption that newer always means better. When we appeal to novelty, we treat recency as evidence of superiority, preferring options simply because they are modern or innovative. It feels progressive, this embrace of the new and different. Yet newness itself guarantees nothing about quality or effectiveness. Recent developments may represent improvements or merely changes. Innovations may solve problems or create new ones. Consider the consumer who purchases each new technology primarily because it is the latest version, regardless of whether it actually improves upon previous models, or the organization that continuously adopts trendy management techniques without evaluating their effectiveness compared to established practices, or the intellectual who dismisses traditional wisdom simply because it originated in earlier eras. In each case, chronological recency substitutes for demonstrated merit. Our vulnerability to this pattern likely reflects both cultural and psychological factors. Modern societies often celebrate innovation and progress as inherent goods. There is wisdom in openness to new possibilities, in recognizing that improvements frequently require departure from established patterns. Yet uncritical preference for novelty reflects the same failure of reasoning as uncritical preference for tradition, prioritizing temporal position over substantive evaluation. Philosophers have long contemplated the relationship between innovation and improvement. While some emphasize the importance of creative destruction and paradigm shifts, others note that genuine progress builds upon rather than merely replaces what came before. The thoughtful approach evaluates new and old alike based on their actual merits rather than their temporal status. Now consider how the most valuable approach neither fetishizes novelty nor rejects it outright, instead assessing each option based on its specific qualities and contexts. The wisest perspective recognizes that some traditional practices have endured because they work well, while some innovations represent genuine advances worthy of adoption. The appeal to novelty mistakes recency for superiority, newness for improvement. Yet time of origin, whether ancient or recent, reveals little about actual value. Ideas and practices must ultimately be judged by their effects and evidence rather than their chronological position.